Term limits is not the issue. Career politicians are not the issue. Corrupt politicians are the issue.
59% of senators had served less than 12 years.
If you will get in a congressional district and get 500 people to keep them to the Constitution, call their office, keep tabs, you can move their votes.
We don't need term limits because we already have a process called elections.
Term limits is the bait that is being used to bring people along to support the very dangerous idea of convention of states.
You basically introduce new problems that are actually more serious and more open to corruption than not having term limits.
The Constitution's not broken. Everything we need for our problems today is in the Constitution, Article 6, upholding the oath of office. What you're seeing today is a failure of those we elect to uphold the oath of office.
I'm Ryan Howard, and today we've got a very important and timely topic, term limits. This is a topic that I've actually changed my position on after driving deeper into the arguments, and so I think you're going to be excited to hear what we have to share today. I've got two very special guests to talk with me about this very important topic, Tamara Scott and John Strathman. Now, Tamara Scott is the National Committeewoman for the Republican Party of Iowa and is the state director for the group Concerned Women for America. She has hosted radio and TV programs since 1998, and she currently hosts a weekly show online called Tamara Scott Live, Monday through Friday at noon. And I'm also joined by John Strathman, who's a member of the State Central Committee for the Republican Party of Iowa. He's actually on the State Platform Committee as well. And he's also a District Executive Committee chair. And he's on the board of directors for the Iowa Right to Life. And he does some lobbying there as well. So we've got some big hitters with us today, and I am so excited to dive into this very critical, important, and timely topic. So this can be very complicated, and these two are going to help us sort it out. So Tamara and John, welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you,
Ryan.
Thank you for the invitation.
Now, we're got a lot to dig into, so let's just get right into it. So Tamara, why don't you just give us a sort of a summary of the current state of this discussion regarding term limits in the U.S. today?
So the idea of term limits has been gaining. Actually, it came to us in 1996. I think California was the first state to bring us term limits. And I guess I would say to all of your viewers and your listeners out there, how's that working for us? California, our role model state, everything better in California now. What they realized was it created a lot of erratic policy because people weren't there long enough. So they'd switch out. They didn't understand why things had been the way they were because no one was there long enough for continuity. And so they realized they needed to fix it. So in 2012, they came through and they changed it from a 14-year term to a 12-year term. But instead of having to serve only 7 in one chamber, you could stay 12 years in one chamber. And so it gave a little more continuity. Still have issues with the budget because those people aren't there. They know they're not going to stick around when the chickens come home to roost. And so you see the runaway budget that you have in California, you see the problems. It doesn't fix it. Term limits is not the issue. Career politicians are not the issue. Corrupt politicians are the issue. And so that's why I wanted John to come on, because John has some great statistics to kind of bring this out to people. Term limits is the bait that is being used to bring people along to support the very dangerous idea of convention of states, which is a political action group wanting to have a convention, a constitutional convention. And that will place our Constitution, our US Constitution, the only obstacle to a North American Union, the only obstacle to one world governance, the very thing that while it was trampled the last 2 years is the one thing that gives us our freedoms and our liberties and our protections. It's been a beacon to the globe, to people across the globe. But they're using term limits, balanced budget, local control, reining and spending, all these key conservative talking points to get us to follow along and want to put our Constitution up on the chopping block, literally. And so this is why we have to talk about term limits, because people are, I think people will be informed by what they hear from John and may change their minds like you, mind like you did.
Yeah, and it was it's pretty incredible. And John, we're going to get to just a second some of the the merits of this and whether it's even necessary. But before we do that, you mentioned I think we mentioned conservatives that are being targeted for this, and I think there is a specific push to get into the Christian conservative circles for this, and there is some misleading happening and some gamesmanship and all kinds of that stuff, and that's why it's really important for us to talk about it on this show. So can you tell us, Tamara, about that, what's
Sure.
going on there?
Sure, and that is my opinion, and I'm getting a little bit of heat from the Convention of States folks on this with anonymous letters sent to my home, a little threatening. But here's the deal: they're purposely going to the National Religious Broadcasters Association. They're coming to conservative, where gun shows are, to Second Amendment folks are, and they get them to sign a term limit pledge. And then they use those names. We've got instances where they've used those names for Convention of States, and those people, when they're called by the elected officials, they say, "I didn't do it. I didn't sign a Convention of States pledge. I signed a term limits pledge." And so again, it's being misused. And this was done early in 2011, 12, 13, maybe, what we call the immigration table. Immigration table was started by an Obama staffer. And they purposely said at the meeting of pastors that we realized we would not move America on illegal immigration until we moved the church. So they learned the lingo. They twisted scriptures, they used statistics or misused statistics, told pastors that they needed to welcome illegal aliens so they could evangelize. Well, friends, we don't have to entice people to break the law to evangelize. And there are people in this country that need God, and we have plenty here. So first off, it's not Christian to entice people to break the law, right? So that was just a bad policy, but it's the same formula I now see and recognize being used on Convention of States. They're purposely talking to conservatives and Christians. And then the liberal progressives who are supporting this will sweep in, and we will have a new constitution, if not a repealed or revised constitution, if not a new constitution.
Yeah, and I think we've seen this. I mean, there's a documentary out called Enemies Within the Church that talks about this sort of just this whole idea of the leftism coming into the church. And we've got these pastors that are sort of celebrities and, really more like a CEO of a production company, but, and a public speaker, but, they want to look cool. They want to be cool. They want to fit in and all this stuff. And it just feeds right into it. And I think you had mentioned, there's presentations happening where there's all these, pro-life, pro-gun, pro-family, pro, all the right things. And then right at the end, slipping in this term limits thing that it just seems like such a natural thing, and it's easy to make the case for, but it falls apart. Now, let's get into, John, some of the merits of this is that, is it even needed? I think you got some numbers to share on that.
I do. And Ryan, I have to, before I start, the last comment you made, I just recently served as a panelist for a Christian-based group that evaluates races across the country. And I'm going through this one candidate, and he's just awesome on life, and he's awesome on, everything. And I'm just cheering, and I get to the end, and he's holding this thing, and he signed a term limits pledge. And I'm like, no. So
yeah.
One of
been
the things
been there, but
yeah.
I didn't stay there though.
Yeah. So one of the first things when I first started just searching for information, I came across a Congressional Research Service report, and it looked at different length of different terms to see what was going on. So in the U.S. House, where the members, they serve a 2-year term. So they looked at, well, how many House members have been there 6 years or 3 terms? And they found that 42% of the House members had served less than 6 years. And then they said, well, what about 8 years? 60% had served less than 8 years. Well, what about 12 years? 71% had served less than 12 years. Oh, so then in the same report, it looked at the U.S. Senate. Of course, in the Senate, the term is 6 years long. And so they said, well, let's just look at 12 years out because, 12, that's as high as they looked at the House. 59% of senators had served less than 12 years.
Wow.
And I could see that expression on your face. So I'm not one, I like to have multiple sources. So I dug into my own numbers. And so I looked at I looked at the Iowa House and the Iowa Senate, and also the U.S. House and the U.S. Senate. And I looked at the years from 2015 through 2021. Okay. Mm-hmm. And here's what I found. So in the Iowa House, again, Iowa House, they serve a 2-year term, and our Iowa House has 100 seats. Okay. And in that 6-year period from 2015 to 2021, 64 incumbents had come and gone in 6 years.
Wow.
There's only 3 general election cycles in there.
Yeah.
So out of 100 seats, 64 of those people had come and gone. I'm like, we need somebody to bar the door.
Yeah.
When I looked at the Iowa Senate, so our Iowa Senate, we have 50 seats and they serve 4 years. In the Iowa Senate, that same period, 2015 to 2021, 29 had come and gone, over half the seats.
Wow.
Okay. So then I went to the US House, and this one really surprised me. Again, I'm only looking at 6 years, 3 general election cycles. In the US House, 435 voting seats in the US House. 239 had come and gone in that period. 239. Wow. In the US Senate, you've got 100 seats, and they serve 6-year terms. And according to the Constitution, 1/3 of those seats are up for election every general election cycle. So it takes 3 cycles before every seat's been up for election once. So in the US Senate, 31 had come and gone. So that meant that's almost 1/3 of the Senate, and each seat had only been up once.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Get that? Okay. So,
so what you're saying is, career politicians and people being there for 70 years may not be the whole problem.
Right. And so one of the arguments that we hear a lot of times, Tamara's been in the battle, I've been in the battle, and usually the people talking about term limits will mention an individual. And a lot of times they'll mention an individual that isn't on their ballot. I don't want so-and-so, but they're from that state, but I want them term limited out.
Yeah.
And so one of those examples that people use, I'm not trying to pick on this lady, but is the current Speaker of the US House. And so if I look at her,
Nancy Pelosi, for anybody who's not following, yeah,
yeah,
I'm sure you've heard that name before. Hair salon and getting
yeah. Well, you get extra points on Ryan's show if you can fill in these blanks.
Yeah.
So Nancy was first elected in a special election in 1987 to the US House. So she's been there a while, almost 35 years. But to me, the underlying problem there is her district. So she's from the 12th Congressional District in California, which is just geographically, that's the tip of the San Francisco Peninsula. So San Francisco, who wants to move there right now? But
right.
Another subject. But in her district, the Democrats have a 10-to-1 advantage over registered Republicans. If you're a Christian conservative, you're never going to win an election there.
Yeah.
Okay. So to me, term limits doesn't solve that problem. The underlying problem is it's a non-competitive district.
Right. And so term limits, all it would do would be whoever Nancy picked as her replacement, or whoever her funders or donors picked as her replacement. What do you have to say about that?
Yeah. I mean, you get Nancy Pelosi 2.0.
Right.
Oh, yay. And at the same time, because of term limits, you just shot yourself in the foot, maybe threw out good people.
Right. That's the key right there. It's much easier to get moderates elected or liberals elected. The media is never going to help get conservatives elected. Once you get them in, why can't you reward good behavior?
Yeah.
But once they're out, these guys, what it's also going to do is create apathy, because it is more difficult to take out an incumbent. We understand that, but it is doable. If you look, Tom Daschle, Senate leadership, US Senate, taken out as an incumbent. Eric Cantor was in the House leadership, taken out in a primary as an incumbent. So it's possible, okay? But people will wait for an open seat. So what you're going to do is you're going to grow that apathy, and people will just wait for a term to be up. It won't help bring new people in. And what you just said, she will be grooming, the media will be grooming, they will be getting name recognition out there for someone who will now have a committee appointment, a resume to be built. And so that all they'll do is build name recognition for the next one to replace her, and it will make it that much more difficult. What I also think will happen is it's hard enough right now to have elections without outside money coming in, big money, big lobbying money. If we have term limits, they're going to know exactly when those terms are up. No more guessing games of if somebody's running or not running, when they're not going to run. You will have out-of-state players feeding into your elections at a phenomenal rate, and they will have more power than you do.
Yeah, and we're even, I mean, we already see a lot of out-of-state money coming into Iowa from the West Coast. I mean, even I remember 2020 when I ran, there was millions of dollars coming in to the Democratic Party there, and it's all these influences and all that. And I mean, we started to get into, I mean, it's not that all the problems go away with term limits. It's you basically introduce new problems that are actually more serious and more open to corruption than not having term limits. And I think one realization that I had was that you have leadership that's been there for so long, and then you have all this turnover, except for some of the leaders, and then new people are coming in and they just sort of go along. But if actually these people could stay longer, like these conservatives, like you mentioned, then they would know more how things work and hopefully get some new leadership in there. But Tamara, you were going to say something, I think.
Well, you hit a couple points. So if you don't have people who can stay there and learn where the problems are coming from, it's going to take some time to figure out how you solve them, what you have to do strategically to solve them. But your bureaucrats are unelected. They are unaccountable. And Barton, who supports convention of states, and I did totally disagree with him on that, but I agree with him in so many other issues. But he's the one in 2014 came on and did an interview with me and said that the bureaucrats had created more laws and regulations through their regulations, surcharges, their fines, than the Congress had legally passed.
Wow.
And so if you have term limits, the bureaucrats
let that sink in. Yeah, that's right. They'll rule the day. And when you don't have to look very far to see politicians coming out of office into some cushy job or into, especially when we talk about the pharmaceutical industry or coming out of regulation into the companies they were regulating. And, look at how that worked out. I mean, but sticking with just the elected politicians, I mean, it's incredible to see. And it would be even more of the case with term limits.
Okay, so
go ahead. Ryan, there was you had also talked about outside money. I don't want to get too far off our topic on term limits here, but I had done a look at the 3rd district congressional race in a prior cycle, and the Democrat candidate here for our 3rd district, just over 75% of her individual donations came from outside of Iowa.
What?
And I'd have to look at the data. I had it broken down by state. I think and I may be wrong about this, but I think the #1 state was California.
Wow. Did you listeners, did you hear that? An Iowa election, Iowa, the middle of the United States. Okay. Even while the Democrats here used to be more central, but none of them are now. I mean, they don't, not the way they vote. But 75% of the money coming from outside of Iowa. Does that sound right? No, that's not. Go ahead, Tamara. You were going to say something.
Well, you had mentioned how much these favors would happen. If you know you're going out, you're a lame duck. There's nothing that the folks back home, they can't reelect you.
Right.
So who are you going to listen to? Not the folks back home.
Yeah.
You're going to be listening to the lobbying groups, to the bureaucrats, even the party folks. See if you can maybe get yourself a spot in the party, a cabinet position or something else, and you will sell out the people at home. It's human nature. Our founding fathers saw that. We had term limits in the Articles of Confederation. They called it eligibility of service, and they took them out because people were making deals before they left. If I know I'm leaving and you mentioned pharmaceutical company, but you could find me a position on a board or find me a position if I help you pass some other bill. Imagine what that's going to look like, because these folks will be looking for the next job.
It's a stepping stone at that point. Like, I make a career plan for my career. I've got maybe 10 or 15 jobs I'm going to have in my career. And now running for office just becomes one of those that's actually used and leveraged and in a different way that other than what it should be used for, which is to make a difference and represent the people and do what's right and honor the Constitution and stand up for the rights that God gave us in this country and everywhere, but that we have protected in this country, or that the government's supposed to be protecting.
You'll still have career politicians. They'll just be shuffling.
Right.
They'll just be finding different areas to serve.
And passing the baton to the next person behind them. Yeah.
Absolutely. And so there's some more talking points on that, but John, did you have any more stats?
I do. I want to just give a couple more examples of say incumbents that are cited for term limits. So, and Ryan, your audience can get extra points on this because I'm going to give an example, but it's called the squad and there are 4 members. So if they can identify which one of the ones I'm talking about, you can give them extra points. Okay.
Yeah.
So this member of the squad was first elected in 2018, so only been there for 4 years, from New York's 14th congressional district for your audience.
AOC. Excuse me. I had something in my throat.
So the registration advantage in her district is 7-1, Democrats to Republicans. So again, the underlying problem there is that a Christian conservative or Republican is not going to win there. And secondly, she's only been in office 4 years. So where are you going to set term limits on the day you take the oath of office? I mean, that doesn't solve that problem, no matter how you look at it.
Yeah, no matter which way you cut it.
And then the last example I'll give is the senior senator from New York. He's been in office for about 24 years. The registration isn't as bad, but it's a little bit higher than it's about 2.2 to 1. So imagine if you're golfing and you got to give the other guy a stroke every time. I mean, you just will meet him at the 19th hole.
Wow. That's incredible. And that's Schumer, right?
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
You won the prize.
That's an easy one. Yeah. Well, yeah. So I think, Tamara, I mean, if we could see here, like, what problem are we solving? I mean, it's not, I mean, what you're just kind of trading one problem for, like, actually a lot more problems and really we're going to talk about a little later what the solution really is, but obviously informed voters is where we need to be, and we need to be active. And that's what we are trying to do is to, I want to help this podcast. We want people to be intentional, influential, and impactful with their faith, and get their faith outside the church into the world, and get it into influencing government and politics and the workplace and family and all of these different things, and start to take territory, take ground, and be informed and engaged, understanding the times and taking action. So, Tamara, I think you were did you have another point, or we want to go back to the problems? Some of the other problems with term limits.
I done a good job of getting some of the talking points in there, but your folks back home will lose their voice. The lobbyists will be heard. They will have the ear, because they will have the ability to influence or possibly find a job for someone. The bureaucrats will rule the day, but the voters back home will lose their voice. As you have now a senator who is in a lame duck session for 6 years, a House member is in a lame duck session for 2 years. And then the state Senate, then 4 years here in Iowa. So we'll be the ones to lose, not the elected officials. And then we also have bills that we think have been passed because people were in that lame duck session and they wanted to go ahead and find a spot for themselves. They wanted to please the party or do whatever it was that way. And then just right here in Iowa, let's just be real clear. John likes to not give the names, but here in Iowa,
I'm making sure they make it in the show and the transcript. So
we have a congressional district, Rod Blum, who I just think is such a great individual, a nice man, think the world of him and his wife. But he took his office in 2014. He was voted out. He lost as an incumbent into 2018 when Abby Finkenauer beat him. She was voted out as an incumbent in 2020 when Ashley Hinson beat her. So there's your seat, 3 different turnovers since 2014. And yet he's now traveling the state with, I guess, Ken Quinn from Term Limits USA and telling people they need term limits. And he is the example of why we don't. Elections work when people get engaged.
When people get engaged.
Right. And then David Young lost his seat. And as an incumbent, and even Steve King lost his seat in a primary election to another Republican. So there is across the board. We've given you House seats, we've given you U.S. seats. Don's given you state and federal. Term limits, time served is not the issue. It's the service during that time that's the issue. And why would you punish yourself? As voters, why is someone else's solution to remove your liberty to select who you wish to serve you? If you have a good individual who's doing the right thing, who isn't becoming part of the swamp, why shouldn't you be able to elect them as long as they continue to serve you, the people, because they are a gem to find if they have that Exodus 18:21 quality. They're not taking bribes. They're people of integrity, the servant's heart. Those are who you want. Once you get them in, why cost the voters that much more money in an expensive election? Why do this? The whole thing it's a rabbit trail to keep us running and distracted from the real issue at hand. And that is that we don't need a new constitution. The system is not broken. It's we're broken as individuals. And our founding fathers said the Constitution is made for a moral and religious people. It's inadequate for any other. And that, my friends, is the problem. It's inadequate for any other. The solutions we need to fix every issue we have, whether it's overspending, whether it's overreach, whether it's constitutional liberties being, stripped away these last 2 years, which, by the way, Convention of States was silent. Where were they? Why weren't they helping us reclaim our protections and our liberties during the last 2 years? They were nowhere.
Right.
Because they want it to be so bad that the people are so desperate, they're willing to risk our Constitution. And their own attorney, Robert Kelly, has said, we want to undo the first article, the second article, the third article, the fifth article. That's your first 3 articles or your 3 branches of government. That's not an amendment, friends. That's an overhaul.
Yeah.
And then the 5th article is the very article that they're using, I think, misinterpreting to call for this convention. I don't think they're accurate in the way they're doing it. But they want to make it easier to undo the Constitution, to revise it, to rewrite it. You know what we call countries who do that, who rewrite their constitutions frequently? We call them unstable. We call them violent. We call them ripe for regime change. It's a terrible idea. God gave us a tremendous gift when he gave us the Constitution. Webster said miracles don't happen in clusters. Be careful and preserve this one. And I don't think the near godless men of today can outdo what the God-fearing men did in 1787.
That's exactly right. Well said. That's a great summary. And that gets us into sort of like, what's really going on here? I mean, what's the real issue? Because what I've seen, even running for office as a campaign, I knew the issue's not the issue very often. I knew when things don't look like they add up, it's special interests and money and funding and this and that. And as I ran for office, boy, was it way infinitely worse than I even thought. And I wasn't even elected close, but I mean, I got to see a lot of the stuff and just talk with different people who were in office. And it's shocking. And this just puts gasoline on that fire. It doesn't put the fire out. And so maybe let's talk a little bit about what gives, what's with all of this support. I mean, I know we're talking about Convention of States and changing the Constitution. And one of the things, it's kind of like a lot of people don't follow the Constitution the way it is today. So why is changing it going to do any good? Like, that's not the issue. The Constitution is not the issue. So what's going on here?
Great point. The Constitution's not broken. Everything we need for our problems today is in the Constitution, not Article 5, Article 6, upholding the oath of office. What you're seeing today is a failure of those we elect to uphold the oath of office, whether they're state elected, city elected, county elected, or federally elected. They uphold the US Constitution along with a state constitution if that's their role. So what we're seeing is that failure today, and even state legislators are now signing on for a Convention of States, ALEC, I think it's the American Legislative Exchange Council, I'm not sure, but that's the same group that brought us Common Core and many other liberal ideas that would not otherwise be accepted by the voters, but it's coming through the corporate arm. I think ALEC is what some refer to as the corporate arm of the Republican Party, more of a moderate voice of the Republican Party. And so they're pushing it. They had Convention of States come and speak and teamed up with Wolfpack. And if your viewers and listeners want to do a search on Wolfpack, it's a liberal group. So they've teamed up with this liberal group to push this Convention of States. But I do believe it's coming from those who want open borders, cheap labor, one world government, a North American Union, and the US Constitution is the last obstacle to help making that happen. Yeah. So even for all of the failures of those who upheld it, because it's not the failure. And we have a process which we can amend it. It's the same way we did the Bill of Rights all at once, or we did the other remaining 17 amendments. We have 27 in all. All were done the same way. Mm-hmm. But none have ever been done through a Convention of States. We've never attempted a Convention of States because I don't think anybody ever thought it was supposed to be misused like this group is trying to say or persuade us that it's intended to be done.
So, and we're going to get into some more details of the convention of states, because obviously that's the kicker here. But this, like you're talking about, I'm just thinking of this term limits idea. It's just like putting water in a 5-gallon bucket with holes in it, where it's like it fills up and it looks great, and then you're just kind of walking along, and what's happening here? It's just, and all of a sudden the bucket's empty. It's just it's not worthless. It's not doing what it's supposed to do or what they say it's going to do. And so there's a couple of points that I want to touch on that are other arguments where, but the leadership is staying the same. And we're seeing, if we have Democrats elected and Nancy Pelosi is still the speaker and all this, and if we had term limits, she wouldn't be able to be the speaker anymore. But I guess, what's the argument against that?
I think, and maybe I'm wrong on this, but I think Republicans decided to change up leadership in their committees a while ago. And you saw, remember when Graham turned it over to Grassley for the judicial? I think Republicans did that. Now, if voters wanted to get involved and make their voices heard, Republicans, Democrats, what they'll do is listen to the people. Once the people make their voices known, even in the Democrat Party, they will listen to the majority. Robert Brown says the power of 500. If you will get in a congressional district and get 500 people to keep them to the Constitution, call their office, keep tabs, you can move their votes. And so just like the Republicans have now changed their leadership, if Democrat voters would, they could force it out of their party.
And there's that word again. You keep using that word, voter. I mean, voters have a response. It's almost like these people are here to like represent voters or something. I mean, like they should listen to the voters, but if the voters aren't talking, right, what are they going to know? And I think I've heard people, a lot of these elected leaders want the voters to talk to them because they want to be speaking to stuff about their leadership or making changes, but they need to say, hey, look, I got 10 calls about this. I got 5 emails, all this. And if they get that many people contacting them on the same topic, like that's a big deal. Like you don't just get 5 or 10 or 20 people emailing you even about the same thing. If it's not, I mean, that's we got to do something about it. So that's the motivation for an individual to get their family, get their friends, get in touch with your legislators and let them know what you want and what you're disappointed with and what you want to see. And so I think just, again, active voters. And that's what we're trying to stir up here, because we see all this, there's so much gamesmanship and misleading happening. And now we're doing a little Ryan's rant, but we can, all this stuff happening, but we need to look a little deeper, and it doesn't take much. We don't have to look look at all these ideas. They fall apart almost on their face. I mean, it's like one follow-up point or one follow-up question, and every argument for term limits falls apart. And so one last point before we go to Convention of States. What about the president? Should the president have term limits, or why not?
That's a fair question. Okay. And here's why I am quite comfortable with the presidency having term limits, but nothing else. The presidency is the only nationally elected office. Your congressional offices, your senatorial offices are regional. They're either by state or your congressional districts. But the presidency is a national office. Also, it's the only office in the executive branch. It is the only elected office. The president, vice president, they run together, is the only elected office in that whole governing branch. So that's my issue. Yes, we have other things at the federal level. You know, at your states, you'll have at that executive level, at your states, you'll have a attorney general or an auditor. But at the US level, that is your only elected offices, president and vice president. So we saw when Roosevelt was in office, what could happen there. And so it made sense to remove that one, or to limit that one to 2 terms, because you can't door knock as a president, right?
Yeah.
You can't really campaign like we can in town halls and ask coffees. We see it happen, but a lot of those are TV photo ops and not in every nook and cranny of the country. So that's why I'm okay with it as the presidency. And as well, the president was never to control every bit of our lives like we're seeing happening right now, the overreach coming out of that office. Never was that intended. He was not to be involved in our healthcare, not to be involved in our children's education. So these things are not intended for the president. So some of those things we just need to back away from so that the president you can't see a Biden coming in office and creating harm and undoing everything that was done the last 4 years that helped this country.
That's right. Well, I think it's interesting. Boy, we've brought up a lot of points here. And, the founders, we mentioned this, that they actually tried it and then they removed it, or they saw the problem with it way back then. I mean, it didn't take hundreds of years for that to show up. It was like right away. And so go ahead.
Well, Roosevelt was during World War II. So when we changed that one to a 2-year term, I think was a little bit later in the process, but you're right.
For president, for that, yeah, right.
For the term limit of the US president. But again, the ability to amend our Constitution is already there. We've done it 27 times without issue. Why on earth would we risk this Constitution? Because once you go to a convention and you open it up, there is no limit. And we've already seen several different things being offered as changes people want to make to the Constitution.
So let's get into this a little bit here. And I think the first place to start is this. You mentioned a misinterpretation or a misuse. Could you maybe parse that out a little bit?
Well, I always have a Constitution with me, and John, you probably have yours with you, but it is one paragraph. It is one paragraph. Can you find yours, John, or I can try and find mine? But it is, if you go to all of your articles in your Constitution, this one is probably one of the smallest articles. And again, it's one paragraph. Let me see, I've got my glasses on here. Can she read Article 5? The Congress, whenever 2/3 of both houses shall deem it necessary, shall propose amendments to the Constitution, or on application of the legislatures of 2/3 of the several states, shall call a convention for proposing amendments, which in either case shall be said to all intents and purposes as part of this Constitution, when ratified by legislatures of 3/4 of the states, several states, or by the convention of 3/4 of the states thereof, as one of the other modes of ratification, may be proposed by Congress. Remember that. May be proposed by Congress, provided that no other amendment which may be made prior to the year 1808 shall in any manner affect the 1st and 4th clauses in the 9th section of the 1st article, and that no state without its consent shall be deprived of its equal suffrage in the Senate. All right. So it gives you the way we can do it, but it's a misinterpretation to say that you can call a convention of states because it will be proposed by Congress. You can call on Congress to call for a convention, but Congress will set the rules. Congress will determine all of the processes, the substantive, and I'm not sure if I can find the sheet for me that kind of talks about that and lays it out. I'll look for that real quickly. But Congress will set the Congressional Budget Office. Here it is. According to the Congressional Research Report from 4/11/14, Congress has traditionally asserted broad and substantive authority over the range of Article 5 conventions, procedural and institutional aspects from start to finish. That's on page 18 of the Congressional Research Service reports. So though we've not had a constitutional convention, Congress would be the one who would set the parameters. And let me just tell you this, look at your US senators, your US congressmen. There are age requirements, eligibility requirements, citizen requirements. And if they're going to do that for a US Senate, for a congressional member, that's just 2 years service, for a president, don't you think they would do that for the men or women who would be rewriting the most important document for the Constitution of the United States? And there are no eligibility requirements. There are no instructions. Doesn't tell us how many delegates. Some people say one delegate, one state. Where do you get that from? Some people say delegates in accordance with the Electoral College. So again, California will just run over us. New York will just run over us. Who gets to pick the delegates? If Maine even sends a Republican, Susan Collins, is she going to help us? on conservative issues. We're so thankful for what she did on Kavanaugh, but she left us high and dry on Ketanji Brown Jackson. So again, think this through. There's no guarantee that just conservatives are going to show up. And by the way, they did a mock convention where just conservatives did show up. And of the amendments they passed, some of them inadvertently grew government.
Right. Well, and it's just kind of, if we need to change the Constitution, we should be real clear about what's the problem with the Constitution. And as we've sort of talked about, that's not the problem. And I think we've given a lot of evidence for that case. And so I guess it's just sort of very difficult to think about that. I mean, this really this point is what started, and I celebrate, changing a position on something with more information, not just Hyde having had that position before, but it's like, okay, here's the truth about it. And now you can see what's really going on here. And I think that point alone is just sort of kind of takes the cake to me, where it's just, well, okay, what's the problem? I mean, what actually needs to be changed? What actually needs to, and it's crickets. I mean, do they try to give an answer for this? I mean, what are the real, what do you guys hear as far as, what's the real justification? I mean, is it all the stuff we've talked about, or is there something else they're trying to kind of hide the ball on?
Well, Ryan, I had an interesting conversation talking to one of our legislators. Legislator background, he happens to be a pastor, and certainly with us on pro-life issues, but he's pro-COS. And I talked to him about, my point of view, the reasons they cite for the need, and this legislator's response is, well, I don't believe in term limits. So, well, why are you supporting this? He says, well, our country is so fractured now. He feels this is a way to heal the country. We'll have term limits. We'll bring everybody together. We'll all come together and heal our wounds, and the country can move forward. And he's a man of faith. He's a pastor, right. And his faith in that respect is pretty darn strong. I'm a little bit not quite.
Yeah, blind faith, I'd say, is what I'd call that. Is faith without really a reason to have it in that. But that's okay. I'm glad you mentioned that. That's a good point, because that's what sort of a mistake that many conservatives make, is they think, well, we need to come together on this and we need to partner on this. And it's like, yeah, there's places for that, but not when you have to compromise something that doesn't make sense, right, or is immoral or unethical or just sort of against the founders. And when I was referring to the founders, I was meaning just not having term limits in the beginning, but and the reasoning for that. And so I just think that we're a lot naive to think that we're just going to partner together with the left or with whoever, and that's going to have our best interests in mind. I mean, that's not the case today with what we see. I mean, and you don't have to look far to see that. And it sort of, again, falls apart. So
look at the court cases we still have on our existing Constitution, the longest Constitution, serving Constitution, I think, in the face of the globe is our U.S. Constitution.
By far, yeah.
And yet we still have court cases on it. So do you really think in this politically divided culture in which we live, we're going to come together and create a new document, sing kumbaya, and say, this is it. We all agree. This is great.
Yeah.
We'll be in court cases, one, before we ever get to a convention, because we're going to argue over the delegates, how they're selected, the power that they have, which Publius Hulda would tell you, you cannot limit their authority. They will have unlimited power to do whatever they wish. Your founding fathers came together in 1787 to revise the Articles of Confederation. They were commissioned by their states. Some of them admitted, overstepped their bounds. When they threw out the Articles of Confederation, they came up with a whole new document. Thankfully, they prayed and fasted first. I don't see that happening today.
Right.
They came up with a constitution as it is, and they changed the ratification process. So it was unanimous. Now it was 3/4 of several states. This group would have the authority to do the same. And this is one of the things they're threatening me with. Tamara is saying our Constitution's illegitimate. Absolutely not. I'm saying they absolutely had the power and the authority to do what they did, because they were writing the highest document of the land. They are under no one's authority. And so They gave us a constitution. They could do it again. There are already 6 other constitutions out there that others have offered. One being Robbie George, who apparently sits on the board with Mark Meckler, wrote a conservative constitution. And some people will tell you that there is concerns about the Second Amendment in that constitution. Lawrence Lessig, who toured with Mark Meckler, is a Harvard professor. He was on the Obama administration on the staff somewhere. And he says he wants a constitutional convention to abolish the Electoral College. And others have come alongside and said, we've tried it in Congress. This will be our best opportunity. He also says we need to welcome a runaway convention. If that's the case, we need to welcome a runaway convention. That's Lawrence Lessig, Lessig, who toured with Mark Meckler, the co-founder of Convention of States. So they know the threats that are coming after this Constitution. It won't just be conservatives saying term limits. Arizona, Hawaii has already offered to repeal the Second Amendment. And if they can't repeal it, they want to revise it so that it's not individual liberty to bear arms, but it's a militia.
Yeah. And so, and I think that, you mentioned, I lost my frame of thought there, but we were talking about how what was the point you just made right before, I totally lost my frame there, but the convention, oh, now I remember. So one of the things also that I heard about in the past was that whatever the convention is open for, that's the only thing you can talk about. So for example, if we open it for term limits, we can only talk about term limits. And then, so could you explain why that's not the case?
Where does it say that? Is it in those instructions under Article 5?
Right. That's right. We didn't hear that, did we?
Guys, I don't know if this applies, but I've been in a lot of meetings that have rules passed, and the first thing you get you hear somebody says three words: suspend the rules.
Rules.
Wow. Yeah, that's a great point. So, wow, very simple on that one. So let's talk about, I think there was another thing that we talked about before we started the show, which was the federal spending. John, could you share some about that with regard? Because I know that's another justification that people seem to be using for this.
Just a little history on that. In 1936 was the first proposed constitutional amendment on balanced budget. And since 1982, there have been 9 balanced budget proposals that advanced to the Senate floor, 8 balanced budget proposals that have advanced to the House floor. Tamara's already talked about how the, amending the Constitution works. It's been done 27 times. But what I found interesting there, I found another Congressional Research Service report, and it did a great job of going over the history, how we got into this mess. And basically what it said was, prior to around the early 70s, our country never would incur debt for just normal ongoing operations. The only time we would incur debt was for something specific, like the Eisenhower interstate highway system, paying for World War II. And when we incurred debt for those specific identifiable items, we would then pay that debt off after that event was over. Well, then starting in the 70s, you probably recall the terminology, well, we can have guns and butter. It started blurring the difference between normal ongoing operations and debt for specific items. So you couldn't hardly distinguish the two. And we've been on the wrong track ever since. We need to get our government back to the mindset where we have to, in a sense, the budget has to balance if you're talking about paying for normal ongoing operations of the government.
Right.
We've lost our way on that.
Yeah. So you'll hear people talk about balanced budget. John, and forgive me, I was getting one of my letters from our friendly people there, US folks, and I'll maybe read a paragraph from it, but you hear people talk about balancing the budget, and yes, spending is an issue, but to balance a budget, you do it 2 ways. You cut spending or you raise revenue.
Yep.
And when you raise revenue, that means you tax people more. And as a politician, again, we could quiz your audience. Which route do you think politicians usually take? Only Donald Trump, do I remember, lowering spending, actually working to cut the deficit. And so they'll just continue to raise, all you have to do is raise the revenue. And here's the problem with a balanced budget. There's no limitation as to what you can spend that money on. We see people spending money on things right now that they shouldn't be. They're very lovely programs. Daycare is a lovely idea, but it's not government's job. Healthcare is not government's purview.
That's right.
All these things that are beautiful ideas don't belong under the authority or purview of the taxpayer. They may be under the tither, but they shouldn't be under the taxpayer, right? As Christians, we should get this difference.
Mm-hmm.
And so balancing the budget doesn't stop any of that overspending. All they have to do is raise the taxes. But if you go back to what our founding fathers did, enumerated powers, a term we don't hear very often anymore, but it's already in the Constitution. And if people upheld the oath of office, Article 6, we would hold to enumerated powers. And so as lovely as the idea is, you can't fund what hasn't been listed as the authority under the federal government of what they can do. And then this gives your state legislators not only the opportunity, but the responsibility to say, no, thank you, DC. We're not going to implement this program because it's not within your authority to do so. Nullification or 10th Amendment. These are placed in the Constitution by your founding fathers as a checks and balances so that the states can keep their sovereignty, their authority, and remain out of poverty, frankly. It kind of sounds like a Jesse Jackson rhyme there, but it works, right? So what you need is legislators to stand up and say no. We did this in Iowa a while back when they were putting Medicaid dollars towards abortions. Texas did it first, and then Iowa said, you can keep that Medicaid money because we're not going to fund abortion with taxpayer dollars. That's nullification. It's refusing to implement a bad law. And Robert Brown could give you the great quote from our founding fathers, but this is exactly what they intended. So enumerated powers only spending the money on what is authorized in the Constitution for the US government to do. Otherwise, it falls back to the states, or it should come back to us, private charity, the church, the Christian.
That's right. And there's so many, you hit on so many good points there. And there are so many things that are problems that exist, but they're not problems that the government should be solving. They're actually, a lot of them are problems that the government created. Yes. And we need the government to get out of the way so that we can solve these problems. And so that's just, obviously, that's the direction that we need to go. Now, Tamara, there was some other things we were talking about as well, that some attacks and things have come against you. Is there anything that we need to talk about, or anything that you need to clarify, or anything else you want to say?
Well, let me just say, I've been working on pro-life issues, as long as I've been involved in this. Went to my first caucus, before I was married. People say to get involved because of their children. I was involved because it was the right thing to do, right?
Yeah.
And so while my views like yours have touched on some issues, and let me just say that when they got you to sign your term limits, this is what we've been saying, and they're upset with me for saying this. They come at politicians who are new, young candidates, new to the process, and get you to sign on before you fully understand what you're signing. And that irritates them, but you're exactly what you're talking about. You're not alone. And there's another saying that says, when an honest man figures out he's in error, he either stops being wrong or he ceases being honest. And so what you're doing, changing your mind, is just saying, I've learned more. More politicians, Sandy Salmon in the State House is another one. The more she learned, she backed away. She's filed a rescindment language on this. Representative Brad Truscito in Montana had sponsored the legislation for an application of a convention of states, and then came back and said, I ask you not to sign this. The more I've waited out and prayed it out, this is not the right tool for the right time. The more people learn about this, they back away, which is why Rob Nadelson, in an article, said, we're not going to call it a constitutional convention anymore. I hope to never hear that again. We'll now call it a convention of states. They changed the name, the more people caught on to it and learned how dangerous it was. Now it's a convention of states, and they try and tell people, oh, you'll have your own convention. How is that going to work? 50 conventions are going to have their own conventions, but they're telling you the language has to be exactly the same, and it's just going to happen?
Wow. Yeah, that's right. So, well, I think as we were kind of wrapping up here, and I guess, John, was there any other numbers that you wanted to share?
There sure are. You know, earlier we talked about how much turnover there is in the chambers just through the normal general election cycle. Well, I would just throw into that mix, keep in mind every 10 years we have a census. And right after the census, guess what? We redistrict. We take all the lines, throw them up in the air. And so if you look at, this comes from the Iowa Legislative News Service in February of this year. In the Iowa House with 100 seats, now this is back in February, we're months away from the elections. At least 24 members of the House, almost a quarter of the Iowa House, have announced they're not coming back. And in the Iowa Senate, now normally in the Iowa Senate, 50 seats, we normally only have 25 seats up each general election cycle. Because of redistricting, where we throw in senators in the same district, wound up with new districts with nobody, there's going to be 34 seats on the ballot this fall. And at least 12 of the 50 incumbent senators, again, this is back in February, have said they won't be coming back. So when we get through this election cycle, you'll see a tick up above what we normally have in turnover elections. One other point I'd like to make about the numbers, you know, we've talked about how important it is for voters to be active. I mean, we don't need term limits because we already have a process called elections. But the weakness we have there is specifically in primary elections. And I just look back over the last 4 years. The Iowa Secretary of State's office publishes a turnout report they have on their website, the last 4 election cycles. And they publish this number by major political parties. So for the Republican Party over those 4 election cycles, the turnout ranged from a little above 16% up to 37%. You don't want to exactly take a victory lap when you have that low a turnout. The Democrats, their low ranges from 12% up to about 42%. You know, general elections, we do great. We have great turnout in generals. Primaries, people sit them out.
Yeah. So that's another great point. And just sort of people, a lot of it is lost on how even the process works. I mean, and the importance of a primary and what takes place there and why we need to do it and what happens when we don't. And well, we're seeing a lot of outworkings now of people kind of not paying attention. But if you were asleep before the last 2 years, you're certainly paying attention now. And the idea that groups are going to come together now with the kind of division that there is today is just absurd. And I mean, that's just incredible to me to even hear somebody make that point. But I think, Tamara, did you have something else that you wanted to add before we wrap up?
You saw me bending over. I got my letters out from whoever it is. They're anonymous. And this is the thing about the Convention of States folks. Very rarely can you have honest dialogue. Mark Meckler refuses to debate Robert Brown. Robert Brown has invited him to debate. We've invited him into the state to debate. Montana sent him a registered letter. He will not debate Robert Brown. And so no matter what state folks are in, I would tell your legislators, do not pass or bring up any resolutions for an application for Convention of States until Mark Meckler agrees to a debate with Robert Brown, because voters deserve to hear both sides.
That's right.
All right. And so then they'll send these anonymous things and they still won't talk about the issues. They, besides, you know, being responsible for the abortions of 9 million babies, Phyllis Schlafly, who is responsible for the Republican Party being pro-life, getting the pro-life plank in the Republican platform and creating the RNC Life Coalition. They blame her for this, even though she's, you know, passed at this point. And part of it was because in the 70s or 80s, they tried the pro-life amendment as the bait for Convention of States. And as much as she wanted pro-life, she came through and said, no, remove your call, rescind the call for a right to life amendment through a Convention of States. She understood the danger of opening up the whole Constitution. So here's the latest letter they sent to me, and just listen to this. Are you so proud and arrogant that you think God cannot stand up to good people to counter this tyranny? Do you believe you are the only righteous person? Who is your God that he cannot stand against tyranny? Is your God too small and insignificant to stand up against evil? Listen how they twist the scriptures, the judgmental attitude there, the self-righteousness, as if I don't go for Convention of States, there's no other way to fix this. We've just given you all the other ways within the Constitution. Solutions are already there, written for us. We're just not upholding it. And so am I proud or arrogant? I try not to be.
Yeah.
God can stand up. I know he can, but sometimes he puts us in the position to stand up against evil as well. And I think the Convention of States is deceitful. I think the whole idea of it is deceptive. And for whatever reason, God has me here in this moment at this time to stand up against it, because I think it is the tyranny against our liberty.
Well, that it really puts an exclamation point on the discussion that we've had here. And I think it's just been incredible to go through all of these, and all of these arguments fall apart so quickly. And those who are making these arguments are not able to defend them. They're not even willing to publicly discuss them, which says everything that you need to know about that. So any final words before we wrap up?
They're very good at finding big names, celebrity evangelicals, we all know, right? And so I would tell you all, it's time. The Bible tells you to test everything you know with the word. I would tell you to use your own discernment, to weigh it out, to pray it out. But the time has come where you can't just follow the lead. And if the Bible, there's that Bible verse that talks about the elect being deceived. We think about that in a spiritual context, but I would tell you the actual elected can also be deceived. And so whether it's your evangelical people, your big name people who you trust, we could agree on 80% of the things, 90% of the things, but everybody has the right to be wrong. Allow them to be in error on this. It doesn't mean you have to dislike them or dismiss them. Work together where you can find agreement, but don't give in on something so dangerous and sacred as our Constitution of the United States, because somebody's name is on a sign.
That is very well said. And I like the point that you just made. And I think it was Charles Spurgeon that said, discernment is not knowing the difference between right and wrong. It is knowing the difference between right and almost right. And that's what we need. And we have seen so many celebrity leaders and pastors and these people that are it's just on the face, unbiblical with the approaches. And so if there's ever a time where we need to study and show ourselves approved, it is now, and now is the time. So, well, thank you so much, Tamara and John. It has been incredible to have this conversation with you.
Thank you, Ryan.
Ryan, thank you for what you do. And just so your viewers know, you were one of those candidates that once we learned about you, wish we would have known about you earlier, because your district was tough. But with you as a candidate, you had every opportunity had we gotten some more resources behind you.
Well, thank you for that confidence. I certainly enjoyed running and enjoyed all the support that we did have. Well, to our listeners, if you want to learn more about term limits and Convention of States, go over to ryanshoward.com/term limits. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you in the next episode. God bless.